The harsh, fluorescent light of the shop office bounced off the heavy watermark of the federal government envelope. It was 5 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the massive fabrication floor outside my door was dead quiet. I always sorted the mail before the morning shift arrived. It was a habit left over from the early days of the business, back when a single past-due invoice meant my family wouldn't eat. I tore the heavy paper open with my thumb, expecting to find a standard quarterly tax receipt for the corporate records. Instead, I pulled out an automated discrepancy notice from the Internal Revenue Service. The system claimed that Miller Structural Steel's payroll withholdings didn't match our corporate filings. I sat down in my battered leather chair and read the single page 3 times. My company carried 0 debt, and I funded the tax escrow accounts manually to ensure we were never late on a federal obligation. A mathematical mismatch of this size was practically impossible. The only way the automated system could flag a discrepancy of this magnitude was if someone had intentionally turned off the outbound escrow transfers. I folded the letter, creasing the paper sharply, and slid it into the inside pocket of my heavy canvas work jacket. I didn't leave it on the corporate treasurer's desk for review. That desk belonged to my oldest daughter, Meredith. Until I knew exactly what was broken inside my company, she didn't need to know I was looking. By 6:30 a.m., the main floor was a roaring canyon of industry. I stood near the loading bay, my heavy-duty welding helmet tucked under my right arm. I breathed in the familiar, sharp scent of raw ozone and hot slag that hung in the air. Above me, the massive yellow gantry crane whined as it moved a 3-ton steel I-beam across the length of the shop. I had built this company over 40 years, turning a 2-man welding outfit into a $4.5 million structural fabrication business. We built the skeletal frameworks for commercial high-rises and industrial warehouses across the state. The business was debt-free, asset-rich, and built on the kind of punishing physical labor that leaves permanent scars on your hands and a constant ache in your lower back. Every piece of steel that left this building carried our firm's unassailable clearance mark. It was stamped deep into the metal as a permanent promise of structural integrity. I watched my men work, actively rationalizing the federal letter sitting heavy in my pocket. Automated government tax systems were notorious for bureaucratic glitches and mismatched routing numbers. I told myself it was probably just a simple administrative error that Meredith would catch and correct by the end of the week. I wanted to give her that margin of trust. She was my daughter, and I had sacrificed too much for her future to jump to conclusions over a single piece of government mail. When she was accepted into an elite, out-of-state private university 18 years ago, I didn't have the cash on hand to cover the tuition. Instead of taking out a predatory parent loan, I picked up double shifts on a commercial pipeline project. I worked 16-hour days for 4 straight years to pay her tuition in full, in cash. I wanted her to have the sophisticated financial education I never had the opportunity to receive. I wanted her to run the climate-controlled front office so she would never have to breathe in metal dust or burn her forearms on a plasma cutter. "Morning, boss," my lead foreman shouted over the deafening noise of the grinders. He was a man who had stood beside me on the floor for 2 decades, and he knew the rhythm of this shop as well as I did. I nodded to him, offering a brief, grounded smile. "The raw steel delivery looks clean," I told him, keeping my voice level and focused on the work. My peaceful routine shattered a moment later when the gravel in the front parking lot crunched aggressively. Meredith's pristine, black luxury SUV pulled into her reserved spot, moving just a little too fast for a designated heavy machinery zone. The contrast between her gleaming vehicle and the soot-stained walls of the fabrication shop always bothered me. Today, with that federal tax notice burning a hole in my pocket, it felt like a warning siren. At 9 a.m. that morning, I walked into Meredith's corporate office. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment I crossed the threshold. Her space was a modernized glass cube built into the corner of the warehouse, completely insulated from the noise, the heat, and the dirt of the fabrication floor. She sat behind a pristine glass desk, wearing a tailored designer suit that cost more than my first industrial welding rig. I rested my calloused hands on the edge of her desk, waiting for her to acknowledge me. She didn't look up from her expensive tablet. "We need to talk about the new equipment financing," Meredith said, her tone carrying that familiar, condescending edge. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the glass screen. "I have the commercial loan agreements ready for your signature." I looked at her, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "We don't finance machinery, Meredith. We buy it in cash when the capital reserve is full." She finally looked up, rolling her eyes with a theatrical sigh that she had been using since she was a teenager. She spun the tablet around, displaying a series of colorful, falsified bar graphs. "Your methods are completely archaic, Dad. The operational cash flow is incredibly tight right now." She pointed to a downward trending line on the screen. "Rising steel costs are eating our operational margins, and if we don't leverage this high-interest credit line immediately, we can't maintain production." I stared at the graphs she had generated. We were running at peak capacity, our contracts were paid up, and raw steel prices had actually dipped in the last quarter. The story she was telling me didn't match the physical reality of the steel moving across my floor. "Show me the raw materials ledger," I said quietly. I kept my hands planted firmly on the desk. "I want to see the direct bank feed, not a generated graph." Meredith bristled instantly, pulling the tablet back toward her chest like a physical shield. "I don't have the time to walk you through a modern corporate dashboard," she snapped. She used complex financial jargon to build a wall between us, throwing out terms about liquidity ratios and leveraged assets to confuse the issue. "Just sign the paperwork and let me handle the money. That's exactly what you pay me for." I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice, demand respect, or remind her of who owned the building she was sitting in. I just watched her face. Beneath the expensive makeup and the arrogant smirk, I saw the tiny, rapid flutter of her eyelids. I recognized the look of pure panic hiding behind her sophisticated, corporate smile. She wasn't frustrated by my supposed ignorance. She was terrified of my attention. "I'll think about it," I said, stepping back from the glass desk. I turned and walked out of the office, letting the heavy door shut behind me. The federal tax letter wasn't a glitch. It was a symptom of a massive structural failure, and I needed to see exactly how deep the cracks went. The shop was a tomb at midnight. The heavy machinery was powered down, leaving only the low, steady hum of my old computer tower in the dark corner office. I sat alone in the harsh blue glow of the monitor. I deliberately bypassed the internal accounting software Meredith had installed on the company network. I didn't trust her colorful dashboards or her generated ledgers anymore. I needed the raw, unfiltered truth, and the only place to find it was the direct bank portal for our primary federal tax escrow account. As the sole proprietor of the business, my administrative credentials superseded hers, even though I rarely logged into the system myself. I typed in the routing numbers and waited for the secure page to load. The screen refreshed, displaying the raw, unformatted bank ledger. My chest tightened, freezing the breath in my lungs. The available balance was $0, 0. I stared at the digital numbers, letting the absolute devastation wash over me in total silence. That account was supposed to hold $850,000. It was the federal tax reserve, accumulated over 14 months of record production, waiting for the IRS quarterly sweeps. It was entirely gone. I scrolled down the ledger, watching a 14-month history of unauthorized wire transfers bleeding my company dry. She hadn't just skimmed the profits or given herself an unauthorized bonus. She had systematically drained 4 consecutive quarters of federal tax reserves. She had taken the exact funds that kept me in compliance with the federal government and out of federal prison. The pain of the betrayal was a physical weight, settling deep into the aching joints of my shoulders. My own daughter, the child I had sacrificed 4 years of my life to educate, had robbed me blind. I didn't smash the keyboard or throw my coffee mug against the wall. I didn't drive to her house in the middle of the night and demand answers. Anger is a luxury you can't afford when you are standing on the edge of a financial cliff. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and made a call I hoped I would never have to make. I needed a paper fortress, and I needed it built in complete silence. At 7:00 a.m., the next morning, I sat in a quiet diner booth across town, miles away from the fabrication shop. The cracked formica table was sticky with old syrup, but the man sitting across from me didn't seem to notice. Marcus Thorne was a senior certified forensic accountant and a former federal tax litigation attorney. He was the kind of professional who dealt exclusively in unassailable facts, and he didn't waste time on sympathy. Thorne opened his encrypted laptop, the screen mirroring the neon light from the diner window. I slid the printed bank statements and the IRS discrepancy notice across the table. He reviewed the empty escrow ledgers for 5 minutes without changing his expression. "The IRS doesn't care who actually pushed the button to transfer the funds, Otis," Thorne explained in plain, unembellished American English. As the sole proprietor of this company, you are strictly and personally liable for unremitted corporate taxes. He pointed to the zero balance on the printed page. If the Criminal Investigation Division flags this theft before we do, they will execute a seizure order on your shop, freeze your personal assets, and move for a federal grand jury indictment against you. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was simply mapping the legal terrain we were standing on. So how do we stop them from taking the business? I asked. Thorne tapped his keyboard, running a forensic metadata trace on the deleted electronic wire logs I had managed to pull from the server backend. We preempt them, Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave so no one in the diner could hear. We prepare a safe harbor disclosure package. We go to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division voluntarily, with complete forensic proof that you were actively defrauded by a corporate officer. He looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto mine. We redirect the federal liability from you directly to her. But to execute that mechanism, I need to know exactly where the stolen money went. Sat in silence for 20 minutes while his software probed the bank's external routing history. Finally, he hit a key, and a thick digital file populated on his screen. The money didn't just vanish into the ether, Thorne said, pulling up a state registry file. It was systematically wired to an external shadow entity. He turned the laptop around so I could see the screen. It was a limited liability company registered to a local luxury title office. The shadow company was named after my daughter's middle name. The target was acquired, and the investigation was officially underway. For 3 weeks, I maintained my normal routine on the shop floor. I drank my black coffee, inspected the structural welds, and spoke to Meredith about inventory timelines with total icy detachment. I didn't give her a single reason to suspect that I knew her secret. Behind the scenes, Thorne was meticulously building the trap. When he finally called me to his secure downtown office to review the completed file, the manila folder he dropped on his desk landed with a heavy, definitive thud. I found the assets, Thorne said, spreading a fan of stiff, glossy cardstock across the conference table. They were luxury property deeds. Meredith Shadow LLC held a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, purchased entirely in cash. The portfolio included 3 high-end downtown condos and a lucrative commercial lease in a retail district. She had used my federal tax reserves to buy herself a life of elite social status, funding her corporate climber fantasies with the literal sweat of my floor crew. But the real estate wasn't the worst of it. Thorne reached into the folder and pulled out a second stack of paper. It was a printed log of our internal accounting software, with dozens of lines of modified code, highlighted in bright red ink. She didn't just steal the money, Otis, Thorne said coldly, verifying the malicious intent behind the code. She actively modified the software dashboard you see on your terminal in the back office. Every quarter, the system was programmed to generate and send you a fake IRS clearance notification. He tapped the red ink with his pen. It was designed to keep you completely blind while the massive tax liability compounded. The last shred of my parental denial died in that sterile office. This wasn't just greed or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a premeditated, calculated frame-up. Meredith was fully prepared to let the federal government seize my life's work and send me to federal prison just so she could keep her luxury condos. I stared at the red ink, feeling my remaining affection for her sever completely, replaced by absolute, unshakable stoicism. Is the disclosure package ready for the government? I asked. Thorne nodded, pulling up a secure transmission portal on his computer. The safe harbor package is complete, documented, and verified. File it, I said. Thorne hit the enter key on his computer, submitting the massive digital package directly to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The trap was legally set, and the countdown had officially started. The morning the trap closed, I arrived at the fabrication shop at 8 o'clock a.m. I stood quietly in the hallway outside Meredith's glass office. Her door was slightly cracked, and I could hear her bragging loudly on her cell phone to one of her high society friends. Yes, the closing documents for the new penthouse are ready, she laughed, her tone dripping with unearned entitlement. It's a brilliant investment strategy. I just need to finalize one more corporate transfer to cover the escrow, and the keys are mine. She was actively trying to wire the last of our operational cash out of the company. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to Thorne, who was standing by remotely at his terminal. 5 seconds later, I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Meredith's expensive keyboard suddenly stop. Through the crack in the door, I saw a massive red access denied warning silently appear on her primary monitor. She clicked her mouse frantically, hitting the escape key over and over again. The screen locked completely. Her administrative credentials had been permanently revoked, freezing her out of every financial portal, server, and ledger the company owned. "Hold on." Meredith snapped into her phone, her voice rising in immediate frustration. "The network is glitching. Let me call you back." I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside the glass office, letting it click shut securely behind me. I looked at her, perfectly calm and completely detached. "You can hang up the phone now," I said softly. "The transfer didn't go through, and it never will." Meredith dropped her phone onto the desk, her eyes darting from my face to the locked monitor. "What did you do to the system?" she demanded, trying desperately to project her usual corporate authority. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't answer her question. I walked over to her pristine glass desk and dropped Thorne's massive forensic binder directly in front of her. The heavy thud made her physically jump in her chair. I pulled the direct bank statements for the federal tax escrow account. I said, my voice clinical and hollow. "I know about the missing $850,000. I know about the Shadow LLC, and I know about the downtown condos." The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. She reached for the binder with trembling hands, flipping the heavy cover open. She stared in horror at the printed wire logs, the luxury property deeds, and the red highlighted software code. Her false confidence shattered in an instant, breaking apart into desperate, rapid-fire panic. "Dad, you have to listen to me," she stammered, her polished corporate mask completely dissolving. "I was going to pay it all back. It was a temporary investment for the family. You just don't understand modern finance." "I understand federal tax evasion." I cut her off smoothly, refusing to let her spin another useless lie. "And I understand wire fraud." She tried to stand up, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the reality of the binder set in. "We can fix this quietly. Just let me back into the portal." "You don't have a portal anymore," I said, standing my ground. Marcus Thorne filed a complete safe harbor forensic disclosure with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division at 7:00 a.m. yesterday morning. I tapped the cover of the forensic binder. "The federal government has reviewed the files, and they have accepted the undeniable proof of your software tampering." Meredith gasped, stumbling back against her expensive leather chair as if she had been physically struck. "You reported me to the IRS? They'll arrest me." "Not today," I explained, delivering the cold, legal reality of her situation. "But right now, while you were trying to buy a penthouse, federal agents are executing an immediate jeopardy assessment." I watched her process the absolute loss of her paper empire. "They are placing federal tax liens on every single piece of luxury real estate your LLC owns. They are locking down your stolen assets to satisfy the corporate debt you created." She began to sob, a theatrical, loud display of victimhood that I felt absolutely nothing for. She was entirely legally isolated, trapped by the exact system she thought she could outsmart. I turned my back on her and walked out of the glass office. I left her alone in the room to wait for her inevitable ruin. The institutional fallout moved with the slow, grinding, unstoppable reality of the federal justice system. Over the next 6 months, the Internal Revenue Service executed the tax liens. They didn't send a tactical team to the office or stage a dramatic arrest in the parking lot. Instead, they quietly and ruthlessly liquidated Meredith's entire shadow real estate portfolio. The 3 downtown condos, the lucrative commercial leases, and the unclosed penthouse were all seized by the government and auctioned off to the highest bidder. The proceeds were used to satisfy the $850,000 corporate tax debt she had left on my ledger. Because I had preemptively filed the safe harbor disclosure with Thorne's unassailable forensic proof, the company was completely shielded from asset forfeiture and fines. The business survived the crisis perfectly intact. Meredith did not. 2 weeks after the final luxury property was liquidated, the morning mail brought a formal notice on heavy federal letterhead. A federal grand jury had officially handed down a criminal indictment for grand embezzlement, tax evasion, and wire fraud. She was facing a lengthy sentence in federal prison, entirely alone, with no luxury assets left to pay for a high-end defense attorney. The paper empire she had tried to build on my back had completely collapsed into dust, erased by the very authorities she thought she could manipulate. At midnight, 6 months to the day after I first checked that empty bank portal, I was back on the shop floor. The massive warehouse was dark, save for the heavy industrial spotlights illuminating the loading bay. I stood at the controls of the gantry crane, listening to the low, steady hum of the machinery that had funded my life. Suspended perfectly in the air was a massive, flawless steel I-beam, ready to be loaded onto a flatbed for the morning run. I walked over to the beam, running a calloused hand along the cold, heavy metal. Stamped deep into the steel was the family firm's unassailable clearance mark. It was a symbol of structural integrity that had survived 40 years of hard labor, and it was still standing. True security is never built on clever financial camouflage, and it can never be bought with stolen money. It is built with honest steel, and no amount of paper lies can hide a deliberate theft from the light of justice.